The grand chamber of the high lexicon did not merely exist within the physical constraints of the station. It dominated the acoustic reality of the sector. Every curve of the obsidian walls, every soaring archway of crystallized nebula glass, and every polished tier of the vast amphitheater had been engineered for one singular, divine purpose: the preservation of sound. The air here was not recycled oxygen, but a carefully curated mixture of gases designed to carry heavy, complex frequencies that would otherwise die in the vacuum of lesser environments. Here, a whisper could travel leagues without losing its semantic integrity, and a shout could shatter the composure of empires. In the center of this monolithic silence sat the High Council of Syntax, a triumvirate of ancient beings whose biological forms were as divergent as the stars themselves, yet bound by the sacred, unbreakable dogma that language was the ultimate barrier of the sentient universe. To know a language was to possess the soul of a species, and to the Council, the soul was not something to be shared lightly, nor was it something that could be mimicked by the uninitiated. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of millennia, a suffocating gravity of tradition that pressed down upon the delegates gathering in the lower rings. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the floor, cast by the dim, bioluminescent moss that clung to the high vaulted ceiling, mimicking the constellations of the homeworlds long since lost to time. High Archon Vale, a creature of chitin and harmonics, shifted his bulk upon the dais. His species, the Clitra, communicated through the grinding of tectonic plates located within their thoracic cavities, a language of deep, resonant vibrations that felt more like an earthquake than speech. He looked down upon the assembly, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the dull glow of the chamber, seeing not individuals but biological limitations. Beside him sat Iridia, a fluid entity contained within a hydrostatic suit of shimmering gold, her language one of bubbles and chemical secretion, translated into sound only by the complex machinery at her throat. To their left was the eldest, a being of pure energy and silicon, simply known as the core, who spoke in bursts of radiation and binary pulses that required dampening fields to prevent the sterilization of the audience. They were the guardians of the galactic tongues, the keepers of the separation that maintained order. The debate that had consumed the last rotation was not about trade routes or border skirmishes, but about the fundamental nature of cognition. A new species had petitioned for full access to the archives of the 5 pillars, the 5 impossible languages that formed the bedrock of galactic diplomacy, languages so complex, so physiologically demanding, and so conceptually alien that no single species had ever mastered more than one outside of their own. The very idea that a newcomer, a biological neophyte from the outer rim, wished to attempt the trials of fluency was insulted. It was not ambition, it was madness. Vale's voice rolled through the chamber, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in the marrow of every delegate present. The sensation was nauseating to those unaccustomed to it, a reminder of the visceral power of the high dialects. The translation matrix hummed, converting the seismic intent into the common trade tongue, though it lost the terrifying authority of the original resonance. He declared that the physiological limitations of the soft-fleshed species were absolute, that the vocal cords of a carbon-based biped were akin to striking a hammer against a cloud and expecting a symphony. He spoke of the sheer arrogance of the request. The 5 pillars were not merely codes to be cracked, they were biological imperatives. The crystalline syntax required a throat lined with silica. The void song required the ability to hold breath for cycles and manipulate pressure differentials that would crush a mammal. The temporal weave required a brain capable of processing time nonlinearly. To suggest that these distinct, evolutionarily divergent masterpieces could be housed within a single, fragile mind was heresy against the diversity of life itself. The galaxy was built on the premise that understanding was hard-won, that bridges between species were fragile things maintained by specialized guilds of translators who spent lifetimes mastering the grammar of a single neighbor. To bypass this, to consume languages like rations, was to trivialize the suffering of existence. Iridia's suit hissed, a sound like steam escaping a fissure as she adjusted her posture. Her synthesized voice floated through the air, melodious and melancholic, contrasting sharply with Vale's earthen rumble. She argued not from biology but from philosophy. Language, she posited, was the architecture of thought. To speak the tongue of the war makers was to become a creature of war, to speak. The whisper of the ghost nebula was to accept death. If a single mind were to house the conceptual frameworks of the five pillars, war, peace, entropy, stasis, and creation, that mind would fracture. It would be torn apart by the contradictory philosophies embedded in the syntax. It was an act of mercy to deny the petition. The species in question, these humans, were observed to be emotionally volatile, short-lived, and prone to internal conflict. Their history was a chaotic scrawl of noise, lacking the refined silence of the elder races. They were barely out of their planetary cradle, still reeking of the combustion engines and radio waves of their infancy. To expose such a primitive psyche to the grandeur of the galactic lexicon would be like pouring a star into a clay pot. It would not result in enlightenment. It would result in detonation. The core remained silent, its radiation pulsing rhythmically, a metronome of indifference. It calculated probabilities, simulating the outcome of the human attempt 1,000 times per second. In every simulation, the result was failure, madness, or death. The structural integrity of the human neocortex was insufficient. The neural density required to map the polydimensional grammar of the fifth pillar alone exceeded their biological maximums. Yet the petition remained. The diplomatic protocols of the high lexicon were ancient and irrevocable. If a species formally requested the trial of tongues, and if they were willing to risk the lethal consequences of the neural feedback, the Council could not legally deny them. It was a formality, a ritual suicide permitted to satisfy the vanity of upstart civilizations. The tension in the hall was not born of fear that the humans would succeed, but of the insult that they would dare to waste the Council's time with their inevitable failure. The delegates from the client races, those who relied on the Academy for all interspecies communication, whispered among themselves, a susurrus of doubt and derision. They had seen many try. They had seen the avian species try to chirp the deep-sea dialects and drown in the attempt. They had seen the rock people try to sing the wind songs and crack their own jaws. The humans were just another tragic note in the long, sad song of ambition outpacing ability. The heavy doors of the chamber, vast slabs of meteorite iron inscribed with the runes of the first speakers, groaned open. The sound was deliberate, a theatrical prelude to the arrival of the petitioner. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye, every sensor, every sensory appendage turned toward the entrance. There was an expectation of a grand entourage, a team of cybernetically enhanced scholars, or perhaps a monolithic artificial intelligence unit rolled in on treads to simulate the necessary processing power. Instead, there was a solitary figure. It was small against the scale of the architecture, a bipedal creature draped in simple, unadorned fabrics of gray and slate. It walked with a gait that seemed dangerously soft, its footsteps making no sound against the polished floor. It carried no visible technology, no translator unit, no amplification rig. It was terrifyingly organic. The human stopped in the center of the amphitheater, directly beneath the judgment gaze of the triumvirate. It looked fragile, a bag of water and calcium held together by tension. Its face was pale under the harsh lights, its eyes scanning the tears not with the hunger of a conqueror, but with the quiet, unsettling curiosity of a predator examining a new environment. This was the human representative, Alara. She did not bow. She did not prostrate herself. She simply stood, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, breathing the heavy, gas-rich air with a steady rhythm that suggested she had spent weeks acclimating to the atmospheric density. High Archon Vale leaned forward, the grinding of his thorax amplifying the skepticism of the room. He demanded to know where the rest of the team was, where the machinery was, where the safeguards were. He spoke in the trade tongue, but he laced it with the subharmonics of his own language, a frequency designed to induce anxiety in lesser species. It was a test, a petty flexing of power. Alara did not flinch. She waited for the echoes of his voice to die down, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. When she finally spoke, her voice was shockingly normal. It was quiet, unamplified, and clear. She stated that she required no team. She required no machinery. She requested only the archives and the standard rotation of 1 week. The gallery erupted in a chaotic noise of disbelief. 1 week. The masters of the Academy spent decades honing the inflection of a single vowel in the third pillar. To claim mastery of all 5 in a week was not arrogance. It was an absurdity that bordered on comedy. The Council, bound by the ancient laws, granted the request with a dismissive wave of Iridia's golden hand. They assigned her the Chamber of Echoes, a solitary confinement cell equipped with the total audiolinguistic database of the galaxy. They expected her to emerge in an hour, weeping or catatonic. As Alara turned to leave, she paused. She looked up at the core, the silent member of the triumvirate, and for a moment the radiation pulses seemed to stutter. She tilted her head as if listening to a sound that wasn't there, a phantom frequency that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the mind. Then, without a word, she walked into the darkness of the corridor. The doors slammed shut, sealing her in with the impossible. The delegates laughed, a cacophony of chirps, grinds, and bubbles, relieved that the farce would be over soon, and the status quo, the comfortable separation of minds, would remain undisturbed. They did not understand that the silence she left behind was heavy, not with emptiness, but with anticipation. The Chamber of Echoes was designed to break the mind. It was a sensory deprivation tank for the body, but a sensory overload for the auditory cortex. Inside, the air was saturated with the whispers of 1,000,000 dead civilizations, a constant background radiation of syntax and semantics. A normal mind would try to filter it, to shut it out. Alara sat in the center of the room on the cold floor and did the opposite. She opened the floodgates. The premise of the Alien Academy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of humanity. The aliens believed that language was a tool, a set of rules to be memorized, a code to be cracked. They believed that to learn a language, one had to study its structure. But Alara was not a linguist in the way they understood. She was a human, and humans were the descendants of pack hunters who survived not by being the strongest, but by being the most adaptable. Humans possessed a neurological trait that the elder races had long since evolved out of or never possessed: extreme empathy. Not the soft, emotional kindness, but the visceral, tactical empathy of a creature that needs to predict the movement of its prey or the intent of its tribe. She did not study the grammar of the first pillar, the crystalline tongue of the lithos. She listened to the sound of it. She closed her eyes and let the grinding, shattering sounds wash over her. She didn't try to translate the words into concepts. She tried to feel the physical sensation that produced them. She imagined her throat was made of stone. She visualized the tectonic pressure required to snap a syllable. She bypassed the intellectual center of her brain and routed the sounds directly to the somatic nervous system. Her body began to twitch, her muscles contracting in sympathy with the alien voices. She wasn't learning to speak, she was learning to be. For 3 days, she did not sleep. The cameras in the room, monitored by a bored junior archivist, showed her pacing, twisting her body into strange shapes, making guttural, clicking sounds that made her throat bleed. The aliens watched with morbid fascination. They thought she was having a seizure. They did not realize she was rewriting her own neural pathways, forcing her brain to create new synaptic bridges to handle the alien concepts. By the 4th day, the atmosphere in the academy began to shift. The sensors in the Chamber of Echoes were picking up anomalies. The ambient noise level in the room had dropped to 0. The whispers of the archives had stopped. In the center of the silence, Alara was humming. It was a multitonal hum, a sound that shouldn't have been possible for a single larynx. She was oscillating her vocal cords at 2 distinct frequencies, creating a third phantom tone through interference. It was the rudimentary basis of the second pillar, the harmonic weave of the gaseous entities. The junior archivist alerted the council. Vale dismissed it as a trick of the acoustics, but Iridia was unsettled. She watched the feed. The human's movements had changed. She no longer moved like a bipedal mammal. She moved with a fluid, drifting grace, her limbs trailing behind her center of mass like they were suspended in liquid. She was internalizing the somatics of the aquatic races. She was physically embodying the mindset of the language. On the 5th day, the terror began to set in. Alara began to speak. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She was speaking to the room. She spoke the first pillar. The audio sensors clipped and distorted. It wasn't an imitation. The frequencies were exact. She was producing the sub-bass grinding of the lithos. The archivists checked the medical scanners. Her jaw structure hadn't changed, but the density of the muscles in her neck had spiked. She was exerting enough pressure to shatter her own teeth, yet she continued. Then, without a pause, she shifted into the second pillar. The transition was flawless. The grinding stopped, and the air filled with the whistling, melodic chiming of the gas walkers. The juxtaposition was cognitively painful for the listeners. To hear the sound of a mountain turn instantly into the sound of the wind was a violation of natural law. The council convened in an emergency session. This was not possible. No mind could hold the rigidity of stone and the fluidity of gas simultaneously. The philosophies were mutually exclusive. To understand the stone is to know permanence. To understand the wind is to know impermanence. A mind holding both should shatter. But Alara did not shatter. She integrated. This was the human secret, the weapon they had brought to the knife fight of galactic diplomacy. Compartmentalization. A human mind could love and hate, build and destroy, believe and doubt, all in the same breath. They were walking paradoxes. The alien races were monolithic in their psychology. Their languages reflected their singular biological imperatives. Humans were a mosaic of conflicting drives. Alara simply assigned the stone language to her sense of stubbornness and the wind language to her sense of adaptability. She wasn't fighting the contradictions, she was fueling them. She moved to the third pillar, the thermal syntax of the energy beings. This was the most dangerous. It required the speaker to project emotion as heat. The room temperature around her began to fluctuate wildly. She was screaming in a language of pure rage and pure logic, her body temperature spiking to feverish levels, then dropping to hypothermia as she switched to the cool, detached syntax of the fourth pillar, the temporal weave. The fourth pillar was considered the impossible wall. The language of the Chronos dwellers possessed tenses that did not exist in linear time. One had to speak of the future as a memory and the past as a prophecy. To speak it was to unmoor oneself from the present. The archivists watched in horror as Alara sat perfectly still, her eyes rolling back, murmuring in a language that made the audio recording skip and loop. She was navigating the labyrinth of nonlinear time. On the screen, she seemed to age and de-age, her expression shifting from the weary wisdom of a crone to the wide-eyed wonder of a child and back again in seconds. She was processing the trauma of 1,000 years in a minute. The council was now terrified. This was not a test anymore. This was an ascension. They had underestimated the primitive. They had looked at the soft skin and missed the iron will beneath. They had looked at the short lifespan and missed the hunger that burned bright enough to consume centuries of learning in days. The final day arrived. The week was up. The doors of the Chamber of Echoes opened. The council was assembled, but the gallery was full this time. The entire academy had gathered. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a fearful awe. They waited for a broken shell to crawl out. Instead, Alara walked out. She looked different. She was thinner, her eyes were sunken, and there was a tremor in her hands, but her presence was immense. She radiated a pressure that made the air feel thick. She walked to the center of the amphitheater and looked up at the High Triumvirate. High Archon Vale did not speak. He was afraid to break the silence. He gestured for her to begin. The test was simple: speak the fifth pillar, the void tongue, the language of the spaces between stars, a language of anti-meaning, of silence given form. It was a language that had never been spoken by a non-native without inducing immediate psychosis. Alara closed her eyes. She took a breath that seemed to pull the air out of the entire room. When she opened her mouth, no sound came out at first. Then a vibration began. It wasn't in the air, it was in the bones of the listeners. It was a sound of absolute loneliness, of the cold dark, of the distance between galaxies. It was the fifth pillar. But then she did the unthinkable. She didn't just speak it, she layered it. Beneath the void tongue, she wove the grinding bass of the lithos. Over that, she spun the melody of the gas walkers. Through the center, she fired the heat of the energy beings and the time distortion of the Chronos dwellers. She was speaking all 5 languages simultaneously. The effect was cataclysmic. The translation matrices exploded in showers of sparks. The glass of the amphitheater cracked. The delegates screamed, covering their auditory receptors, but they couldn't shut it out because the sound was resonating with their own biology. She was speaking to all of them in their own deepest, most primal tongues all at once. It was a symphony of existence. It was a declaration that the barriers between them were artificial, that the separation of species was a lie. She was forcing them to feel the unity of the universe through the sheer brute force of human empathy. She was translating the soul of the galaxy. Then silence, instant ringing silence. Alara collapsed to her knees, gasping, sweat pooling around her. The council was stunned. Vale's carapace was vibrating uncontro. Lably, Iridia's fluid suit was churning. The core was pulsing in a frantic, erratic rhythm. They had witnessed a miracle or an abomination. Alara looked up, her voice hoarse, broken, returning to the crude simplicity of the trade tongue. She whispered, "The languages, they aren't just for speaking." The High Archon found his voice, though it lacked its usual thunder. He asked what she meant. He asked what she had done. Alara stood up, shaky but determined. She explained that when she harmonized the 5 pillars, when she stacked them on top of each other, they didn't create noise. They created a key. The languages were pieces of a puzzle, scattered among the species to keep them apart or perhaps to force them to come together. The Academy had spent eons keeping the languages pure, keeping them separate, thinking that purity was strength. But the message, the true message hidden in the syntax of the galaxy, could only be heard when all the voices spoke as one. And what, the core spoke for the first time in a millennia, its voice a synthesized rasp of static, is the message. Alara looked at the ceiling, past the stone, past the station, into the dark. "It is a warning," she said. "The silence is coming. The spaces between the stars are getting wider. The void tongue isn't a language of a people, it's the sound of the universe ending. And the crystalline tongue is the sound of the structure holding it back. You have been arguing over grammar while the walls of reality are cracking. The revelation hit the chamber like a physical blow. The political bickering, the arrogance, the hierarchies, it all evaporated in the face of the existential threat. The humans hadn't just learned the languages, they had deciphered the distress signal of the cosmos. The council looked at the small, fragile creature standing in their midst. They had dismissed humanity as chaotic, short-sighted, and primitive. They failed to see that it was exactly that chaos, that ability to embrace contradiction, to bridge the impossible gaps between concepts, that made them the necessary catalyst. The galaxy didn't need more guardians of purity. It needed a species that could mix the oil and water, that could stitch the torn fabrics of reality together. The twist was not that humans were smarter. It was that humans were the glue. The ancient architects of the languages had designed the 5 pillars not as tests of superiority, but as components of a shield that required a central processor capable of running all 5 programs at once. The council realized with a dawning horror and hope that they were not the masters of the galaxy. They were the components. The humans were the engineers. Alara stepped forward, her strength returning. The fear in the room was palpable, but it was no longer the fear of the unknown. It was the fear of the known, the fear of the coming dark. "We can teach you," she said, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "We can't teach you to speak the other tongues, perhaps. Your biology is too rigid, but we can be the translators. We can be the hub. We can link your minds, your fleets, your technologies. We can harmonize the galaxy. But you have to stop seeing us as children. We are not the students here. We are the interface." Vale looked at Iridia, then at the core. The ancient rigidities were broken. The High Archon slowly, painfully lowered his massive thoracic bulk in a bow. It was a gesture that had not been seen in 10,000 years. It was the bow of a sovereign to a savior. One by one, the delegates followed. The click-clack of chitin, the swish of fluid, the hum of machinery filled the room as the galaxy bowed to the human. Not out of love, but out of necessity. The Academy had declared that no species could master the languages. They were right. No species could. But humanity was not just a species. They were a collection of contradictions, a storm of adaptability wrapped in skin. The lights of the chamber dimmed, shifting from the harsh interrogation glare to a warmer golden hue. Maps appeared on the massive holographic domes above, showing the fracturing lines of reality at the edge of the galaxy, the encroaching silence that Alara had heard in the 5th pillar. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. But for the first time in history, the Council did not retreat into their separate silos to debate protocols. They turned to the center. They turned to Alara. She began to issue coordinates, translating the void warnings into actionable strategies, translating the stone defense into fleet formations, translating the time syntax into logistical schedules. The work was immense. The war for existence had begun, and at the helm, speaking the language of every god and monster in the dark, was the soft, fragile voice of a human, harmonizing the chaos into a symphony of survival. The Academy was no longer a school. It was a war room. And the lesson was over. The test had begun. The implications of the alliance rippled outward from the station at the speed of subspace transmission. The news that a human had cracked the 5 pillars was met first with disbelief, then with a frantic, desperate hope across the myriad worlds of the spiral arm. The diplomatic channels, usually clogged with ritual and bureaucracy, were suddenly flooded with data packets routed through human intermediaries. The Klitrov fleets, massive dreadnoughts of stone and iron, began to coordinate with the fluid, bioorganic ships of the Iridian collectives, a maneuver that was previously impossible due to the incompatibility of their command syntaxes. Human liaison officers, hurriedly trained by Alara and her expanding team, boarded these vessels. They acted as living bridges, their minds straining under the weight of translating not just words, but intent, philosophy, and tactical doctrine in real time. It was a grueling task. Humans burned out, their minds fracturing under the stress of holding 2 alien psychologies in their heads simultaneously. But for every one that fell, 2 more volunteered. The human capacity for self-sacrifice, a trait the Council had dismissed as evolutionary inefficiency, became the galaxy's most valuable resource. Alara remained at the Academy, which had been transformed into the command nexus of the combined galactic defense. She barely slept. Her mind was constantly active, monitoring the psychic feedback from the front lines where the silence was eroding the fabric of space. The enemy was not a fleet. It was an absence. It was a negation of physics that simply erased star systems, leaving behind a silence so profound it drove observers mad. The only defense was to speak reality back into existence, to use the combined resonant frequencies of the 5 pillars to reinforce the laws of physics in the affected sectors. It was a metaphysical war fought with fleets acting as amplifiers. The Lithos ships provided the base frequency, the anchor of matter. The energy beings provided the power. The humans provided the modulation, the syntax that bound the raw power into a coherent denial of the void. Deep within the archives, Alara discovered the true origin of the 5 pillars. They were not evolved languages. They were fragments of a source code, left behind by a precursor civilization that had faced the silence eons ago. They had failed because they were a monoculture. They lacked the internal diversity to speak the full code. They had fractured their language into 5 parts and seeded them into 5 developing species, hoping that one day, a 6th species would arise with the neural plasticity to recombine them. Humanity was the contingency plan of a dead god. This realization brought a profound sense of vertigo to the Council. They were not the pinnacle of evolution. They were storage devices. The arrogance of the elder races shattered completely, replaced by a somber humility. They looked at the humans not with fear anymore, but with a strange, protective reverence. The humans were the key, and the key had to be protected at all costs. As the silence pushed closer to the core worlds, the strain on Alara increased. She began to exhibit changes. Her skin took on a crystalline sheen, a side effect of channeling the 1st pillar constantly. Her eyes glowed with the internal radiation of the 3rd. She was becoming less human and more something else, a living vessel of the galactic lexicon. The Council begged her to rest, to disconnect. She refused. "The sentence isn't finished," she would whisper, her voice overlapping with the harmonics of the thousands of ships she was coordinating. "We have to finish the sentence." The sentence was a complex, galaxy-spanning energy barrier being constructed system by system, a wall of syntax that would define the boundaries of existence and lock the silence out. The climax of the conflict took place in the Ethelgard system, a binary star system that acted as the chaotic pivot point for the sector's reality. The silence had breached the perimeter. Stars were winking out, not exploding, just vanishing from the sky as if deleted. The combined fleets gathered. It was the largest assembly of sentient life in history. Millions of ships, from the smallest human interceptors to the moon-sized world ships of the core. They formed a sphere around the breach. On the command deck of the Academy station, Alara was plugged into the main array. Cables ran into her spine, connecting her nervous system directly to the transmitter. She was the conductor of an orchestra of billions. "Hold the line," she commanded. Her voice was broadcast to every ship, translated instantly into the native emotional resonance of every crew member. To the Clitra, she sounded like the bedrock of their homeworld. To the Aquarians, she sounded like the deep current. To the humans, she sounded like home. "We are going to speak the word of denial." The silence surged. It was a wave of non-existence, a black wall. That ate light. The fleets opened fire, not with lasers or missiles, but with harmonics. The Clitra ships fired gravity beams that pulsed with the syntax of stability. The gaswalkers sang into the void, their ships emitting vast clouds of charged plasma that vibrated with the song of creation. The core directed pure radiation in binary streams of logic, and Alara wove it all together. She screamed the final unification syntax. It was a sound that transcended hearing. It was a command to the universe: you exist. You are here, you cannot be erased. The feedback was horrific. Ships exploded as their hulls resonated apart. Crews died as their minds were burned out by the sheer intensity of the connection. But the wall held. The black wave hit the barrier of sound and shattered. Reality reasserted itself. The stars that had been erased flickered back into existence, pulled back from the brink by the sheer force of the collective will. The silence recoiled, screeching a sound of anthologic that tore at Alara's mind. She fought it, pitting the messy, chaotic, stubborn complexity of the human spirit against the cold perfection of the void. She poured every memory of love, loss, hate, and hope into the transmission. She weaponized the human condition. The silence broke. It didn't retreat, it disintegrated, its conceptual framework dismantled by the superior logic of the unified syntax. The breach sealed. The Ethelgard system was safe. The galaxy was safe. In the command center, the cables detached from Alara's spine. She fell, caught by High Archon Vale, who held her with a gentleness that belied his terrifying form. She was barely breathing. Her body was ravaged by the energy she had channeled. The council gathered around her, their heads bowed. They waited. Silence, true silence, peaceful and heavy, filled the room. Then a ragged breath. Alara opened her eyes. They were no longer human eyes. They were swirling nebulas of gold and violet, holding the depth of the void she had conquered. "Did we finish the sentence?" she whispered. Vale nodded, his tectonic voice cracking with emotion. "Yes, child of Earth, the sentence is finished. The story continues." The aftermath of the War of the Silence changed the galaxy forever. The Academy was no longer a place of segregation. It was the seat of the Galactic Union. Humans were granted a seat on the High Council, not as rulers, but as the voice. The 5 pillars were taught openly, not as forbidden arts, but as essential skills, with human tutors guiding the elder races through the treacherous waters of cognitive flexibility. The galaxy had learned that strength did not come from purity, but from the chaotic, beautiful mess of integration. Alara never fully recovered. She remained in the academy, half fused with the machine, a living oracle who watched the edges of the map. She could no longer speak just one language. When she spoke, it was a chorus. But the galaxy listened. They listened because they knew that in the silence between the stars there were things that waited, and the only thing keeping them at bay was the voice of humanity screaming existence into the dark. The final image was of the academy itself, once a dark monolith of exclusion, now glowing with the light of 1,000 cultures. Ships of all designs docked at its pylons. In the great hall, a human child sat with a Clitra elder, teaching it to hum a lullaby. The elder struggled, its chitin grinding, but the child was patient. "No," the child said, smiling. "Not like stone, like water. Feel the sound." The elder tried again, a clumsy, jagged sound. The child laughed. It was a sound of pure joy, a sound that needed no translation. And in the shadows, the statues of the ancient masters seemed to look on, not with judgment, but with relief. The impossible had been done. The silence had been broken, and the universe was singing. The philosophical shift was absolute. The dogma of the one mind, one tongue was replaced by the infinite weave. Diplomatic missions were no longer tense standoffs, but cultural exchanges. The humans introduced the concept of fiction to the literal-minded lithos, who were initially horrified by the idea of lying, but eventually became the greatest poets in the sector, finding that the untruth could reveal deeper truths about the nature of stone and time. The Clitra introduced the humans to deep waiting, a meditative state that allowed humans to process their frenetic emotions without burning out. It was a golden age of synthesis. Yet amidst the celebration, there was a lingering solemnity. The warning Alara had translated was not just about the silence. It was about the cycle. The source code had been used before, and it had failed before. The twist that haunted the archives was the realization that humanity was not the first key. There had been others, other young, adaptable species in previous eons who had tried to harmonize the pillars. Their fossils were found. On dead worlds, their civilizations burnt out by the effort. Humanity had succeeded where they failed because of one crucial difference. Humans didn't try to master the languages, they befriended them. They didn't treat the alien concepts as data to be processed, but as people to be understood. It was love, that irrational, unpredictable human variable, that had stabilized the equation. High Archon Vale stood on the observation deck, looking out at the rebuilding fleet. He turned to the new human counselor, a man named Thorn, who had been a linguist on Earth before the awakening. "She paid a high price," Vale rumbled. Thorn nodded, looking at the feed from the medical wing where Alara rested in her suspension tank. "She did, but she bought us a future." "Do you think the silence will return?" Vale asked. "Eventually," Thorn said, his voice calm, lacking the fear that would have once paralyzed a human facing such a thought. "Entropy always returns, but next time we won't be 5 separate fingers trying to stop the tide. We'll be a fist." Vale made a sound that was the Clitra equivalent of a chuckle, a deep grinding of plates. "A fist, a very human metaphor." "It works," Thorn shrugged. "Yes," Vale agreed, looking back at the stars. "It works." The camera pulled back, away from the station, away from the system, spanning the spiral arm. The galaxy looked different now. The borders on the star maps were dissolving. The rigid lines of empire were fading into gradients of influence and cooperation. The darkness was still there, vast and cold, but the lights within it were brighter, clustered together, connected by invisible threads of syntax and understanding. The human element had acted as a catalyst, starting a reaction that could not be stopped. They had proven that the most powerful weapon in the universe was not a laser or a gravity bomb or a virus. It was a word spoken with the intent to understand, A word that said, despite the distance, despite the difference, despite the fear, we are one. And in the deep quiet of the Chamber of Echoes, where it all began, the archives were no longer silent. They hummed with a new recording added to the canon of the 5 pillars. It was the 6th pillar. It wasn't a language of words. It was a recording of a heartbeat, a human heartbeat, steady, fragile, persistent, thumping against the dark, a rhythm that every species, no matter how alien, could understand. The sound of life refusing to yield, the sound of the new galactic era, the human era.